Hi, welcome to a special Earth Day episode of Your Stake, Your Story. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Rebecca Brown, the USA Director of Tobacco Free Portfolios.
Hi, Gabe. So nice to be here.
Good to be here with you too. I would love to start. I mean, you have a really interesting history and personal story. Can you tell the audience how you got going with tobacco free portfolios and what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. So I've spent my whole life sort of in finance. In the past 16 years, I was on the buy side at a sort of traditional fundamental value shop. And in 2017, I led that firm's efforts to really approach ESG integration and ESG analysis formally and across the firm. And in 2019, I was successful at advocating for a handful of industries to be excluded from our investment universe, but importantly, tobacco was one of them. And then I met our CEO, Dr. Bronwyn King, who's based in Melbourne, Australia, and was a practicing radiation oncologist who discovered when she went to apply for a mortgage that her compulsory pension was investing in big tobacco. And you can imagine that as somebody who was watching sort of firsthand the health impacts and the devastation to people that the industry caused, it really didn't sit well. Interestingly, I made a pivot as well from the private sector to the NGO side about a year and a half ago to join this organization where we partner with financial institutions to really educate them and make them feel comfortable with tobacco-free finance. We're really trying to mainstream that conversation for a number of reasons.
Love hearing that story, and I think what you shared about the founding of tobacco free portfolios is something that I've heard several times where people have a very clear passion for something and they spend their career working on it and then they realize that their investments are doing the exact opposite. And that is a huge motivator for um, a lot of people in this field. So I'm glad you shared that story. So Rebecca actually has a presentation that she's going to share on the main things that tobacco free portfolios focuses on. And because this is a special Earth Day presentation, you're going to learn a lot about the environmental impacts of tobacco, which I really had no idea about before talking to Rebecca. So that's going to be really fun. Um, One thing, because I know a lot of our audience is financial advisors, Rebecca, do you want to share a little bit about how financial advisors currently are thinking about tobacco free and maybe through the presentation you can talk about more what they should be aware of and know.
Right. No, I think one thing to note is that tobacco free really is a foundational and meaningful approach to any sort of authentic attempts at sustainable investing, ESG. As Gabe mentioned, it's not just about the devastating impact on human health, and it's really also about the environmental impact, right? So it's something that often people don't think about, don't know about, but so we found that many financial institutions, financial advisors are implementing tobacco-free as really a foundational approach to their sustainable investing efforts. And I should say, our goal is to really mainstream tobacco-free.
Mm.
So that's really what we've been seeing across, financial institutions and allocators that we've been in with.
Thanks so much. So I would love for you to maybe pull up the presentation and start taking it away. And I already have a number of questions that I'm excited to ask you at the conclusion.
So tobacco-free portfolios, as I mentioned, we're an NGO headquartered in Melbourne, Australia. We've just sort of planted our feet on the ground in the US. And we are an organization that partners with the financial sector to really promote tobacco-free finance as sort of a mainstream conversation. And as Gabe alluded to, it's where we talk about both people and planet. It's really important to note that if things don't change when it comes to tobacco, we're on track for 1 billion lives to be lost this century. So just to put this in sort of a frame of reference, 8 million people lose their lives to tobacco-related illnesses every year. And if you think about that in context of COVID, which understandably shut down the world, that's the same, more lives were lost during the same period to tobacco-related illnesses, and it's not really something that's often discussed. So it's important to sort of understand that this is an inherently unsustainable situation if we're losing 8 million people a year to tobacco-related illnesses. And as Gabe alluded to, it's not just about public health, although clearly that's important. It's important to note that the industry has a devastating effect on the environment. So as an example, cigarette filters are the most littered item on the planet. So 4.5 trillion filters are littered every year. And what oftentimes comes as a just really shocking surprise is that the cigarette butt itself is a plastic. And so it's the number one contributor to ocean plastic by number. It does not biodegrade. It dissipates and gets into the food chain. This, image sort of speaks for itself. But with this attention to plastic waste, it's important to note that Philip Morris is one of the top 10 plastic waste producers, as an example. When it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation, so the tobacco industry life cycle is responsible for about 5% of global deforestation. That is incredibly, it's at a much higher number in sort of low and middle income countries, which are currently the major producers of tobacco. So as an example, Malawi's deforestation caused by tobacco is upwards of 70%. But we have a sort of a tagline that is, there's no room for tobacco in a net zero world. And we've spoken with financial institutions about tobacco-free being really a meaningful first step, foundational step to net zero commitments. So it's an industry that produces products that, when used as intended, have zero safe use. So there's no need for tobacco products. And while, it can be argued with regards to the energy sector on how to best approach engaging or divesting or, investing in green technology, we need energy. When it comes to tobacco products, we don't need the products sort of full stop. When it comes to also supply chain risk, which is of obvious importance when it comes to just evaluating the risk of an industry that you're investing in or a company that you're investing in, it's important to note that tobacco has child labor throughout the supply chain, and nearly no cigarette can be guaranteed free of child labor. Of those countries that employ child labor, a U.S. Department of Labor report, which is noted here in this Human Rights Watch report, is that kids as young as 12 can legally work in farms with in tobacco farms with parental permission in the U.S. So the child labor is in our own backyard, as well as just sort of across the globe. And these kids are often ill-equipped with protective gear, and are oftentimes getting sick from nicotine poisoning. Now, I want to sort of bring it back to youth here as well. So we talked about kids in the supply chain, but we often hear about, or we get questions about, well, what about, vaping products or next generation sort of heat not burn products? And we want to make clear that the marketing message we hear out of big tobacco is that they're producing products that are for adults. And I just want to sort of highlight these images of vaping products that are on the market. They're currently being under, reviewed by the FDA in this country for marketing allowance in this country. But these are not. I'd love anybody to sort of tell me this is geared towards somebody in their 30s or 40s. This is clearly attractive to youth, and why that's important is the tobacco industry has relied on youth addiction in order to sort of keep their business model going, right? I also wanted to touch on racial and social equity and social justice. So there's documented, history of the tobacco companies explicitly and intentionally marketing to Black and Brown communities in this country and sort of across the globe. And why is that important? Well, why tobacco companies like to talk about, moving to a health and wellness company as an example, or a smoke-free future as an example. They fight tooth and nail anytime there's regulation to sort of stem menthol use in across the globe. But right now in the U.S., there is a proposed rule to ban menthol that the FDA is, working on. And I should know that of Black smokers, nearly 90% of them are menthol users, and that's by design. So the communities were heavily infiltrated with advertising. Community leaders have been paid to speak out against sort of regulation when there's any sort of rule against menthol to curb menthol use, and very strategic marketing in sort of community events and in communities of color. So there's these communities they typically smoke less, there's a higher mortality, and there's excess impact on kids, so higher secondhand smoke exposure for kids in these communities too. So if you're a company that's trying to grapple with creating a robust and authentic sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, you really need to think twice about how this industry, if you're investing in this industry still, has impacted the very communities you're trying to, incorporate more completely into your own organization. And we like to sort of show this history repeating itself slide because IQOS and these vaping products have been sort of marketed as, the future of tobacco. But we've seen this over and over and over again, implying that these products are safe. They are not safe. There is zero safe use of a tobacco product. They are not, they're not going to sort of save the day and I bring that up because the filter itself was a marketing approach by Big Tobacco when it was discovered that the use of tobacco products caused lung cancer, right? You see this sort of cheeky image of cool, and use cool cigarettes, which are menthol cigarettes, when you have a cold. The lowest tar cigarette ever. So somehow, implying that this cigarette is, healthier because it has a lower tar. What's interesting is the filters and the way in which these sort of lower tar cigarettes were created were by sort of placing holes around the filter. And when they were tested on a machine, and so the holes were open, right? And there was sort of less tar in some of these machine tests. However, that's not how humans smoke a cigarette. A human puts their mouth on the cigarette and covers the hole. So in any event, what's important to note too is that these sort of menthols and filters create there's no health benefit to it, and they actually create a situation where the smoker is inhaling more deeply, right, than if they were just sort of smoking a filterless cigarettes. So they're not only getting sort of more of the toxins in because it's a deeper inhale, but they're also getting the residue and the particulates from the filter itself. This is where I think it's really interesting for your financial advisors is Big Tobacco's sort of sustainability agenda. They join sustainability groups, they hire sustainability experts, they produce 180-page sustainable CSR reports, they sponsor prominent media events and, attend notable financial events, and they really create confusion. You can see on the right, this is actually an Altria ad. So I think it's probably very, very difficult for folks who are just sort of glancing at an image to sort of, not think that this is an image of, planetary well-being, right? And the world is not our ashtray. Well, that puts, again, the situation on the end user, not on the upstream producer of the product that causes, pollution. So it's at beach cleanups, tobacco filters are often the most collected item on beaches. And when it comes to risk and financial risk specifically, it's important for financial advisors to understand the sort of environment for big tobacco. In the States, we don't see as many folks using cigarettes. Thankfully, there's been a decline in cigarette use. Because of the Master Settlement Agreement in the late 90s, cigarette companies in the US can't sort of put a billboard up in Times Square anymore, right? However, the impact of that industry is still, vast here in this country and globally. And as an example, nearly 500,000 Americans die prematurely every year still from tobacco-related illnesses. But again, to take it back to financial risk, there's increasing regulatory risk, so an ongoing and increasing. And there's a framework convention on tobacco control, which is a UN treaty signed by 180 countries, over 180 countries, which puts pressure, which puts pressure on signatories to increasingly pressure the tobacco industry. And there's a specific clause that says, we specifically recommend zero engagement with big tobacco. So regulatory risk is ongoing and increasing. Litigation risk ongoing and increasing. Supply chain risk, I mentioned child labor is, again, nearly no cigarette can be guaranteed free of child labor. And the environmental risk, so 5% of global deforestation caused by the industry. The industry has larger greenhouse gas emission footprint than entire countries, so bigger than Israel and Peru. It's a number that's staggering and one that isn't, often understood. And the ocean plastic. So that's only amplify the vaping and the heat not burn products. So those are products that not only produce toxic plastic waste, but the lithium that powers those devices is nearly always thrown into landfill. So as an example, it's estimated 6,000 EVs could be powered in the US alone annually by the amount of lithium that gets filled here. And then reputational risk. You really have to justify who you want to do business with when it comes to an industry like tobacco. And so reputational risk is something that financial institutions are very aware of and need to sort of consider too as part of their financial risk. And then when it comes to returns, these are 10-year price returns of the tobacco stocks in the S&P, which is the yellow line, versus the S&P itself, which is the blue line. And over a 10-year basis, you can see sort of really dramatic underperformance on a price basis. What's also interesting are the 5-year total returns, which include, dividend reinvestment. And so 4 of the 5 big tobacco companies have negative total returns. And the one that did eke out a positive return is still, you know, woefully behind the S&P. And we should not forget sort of the outsized economic costs. So while states and governments do receive revenue from the sale of tobacco products, it pales in comparison to the economic cost that is externalized on governments and municipalities. So these are 2018 numbers. It was estimated in 2020 that the cost of smoking in the U.S. is closer to $1 trillion, while the revenue generated is closer to $90 billion. So just outsized economic cost. And so brings us back to the tobacco-free pledge, which we would encourage your audience to consider becoming a signatory of. So we launched this pledge at the UN in September 2018 with about 90 signatories representing about 16 trillion. Since then, even through the time of COVID, we've increased that number to 200 plus signatories representing over $16 trillion committed to tobacco-free finance. We would love for your listeners to consider signing the pledge and amplifying the message, and welcome any questions. So I'll stop sharing, and would love to hear your thoughts and happy to answer any questions.
Sure. Well, let's start with the easy one. Where do people sign the pledge?
So you can go to the tobaccofreeportfolios.org and click on Learn About the Pledge and sign up.
Perfect.
There's no reporting requirements because it is binary. You can run a Bloomberg report and see who holds tobacco stocks, and it is a UN sort of sponsored initiative, so it is aspirational. It is good spirited. We're not trying to gotcha our signatories. And we're really here to partner with the financial sector.
That's awesome. And speaking of the listeners that would be looking at their portfolio, so I think most people recognize, hey, if you remove tobacco from your portfolio, now you can say you're tobacco free. That's great. And that has a public health impact. And actually on the YourStake platform, as we were talking about earlier, we are able to translate that tobacco public health impact into something like smoking related hospital days that you are responsible for based on your proportional ownership of tobacco companies and how you're contributing to the products that they're producing and the public health impact of that. But it's pretty cool for, I think, advisors to realize that by reducing the tobacco in your portfolio, not only are you having that public health impact, but your metrics are going to improve on plastics, on deforestation, on child labor, on racial equity, social justice. So that was something that I think was really fascinating to me as someone that when I first saw the presentation, that was surprising and really cool. One thing that I want to ask is, it's really interesting because you mentioned that tobacco companies are also doing a very hard sustainability push.
Yeah.
And I would say that it's working, at least based on the ESG scores that they get from certain rating agencies. I think there's a lot of articles that come out showing the top 5 companies according to ESG, and a lot of times tobacco companies are in there. So do you want to say what's going on there and what that means?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's obviously very problematic, right? So we would argue there is no best-in-class tobacco companies. So these rating agencies are often ranking like company to like company, right? How do those scores measure so high for a company that produces products that, when used as intended, result in the premature death of half of their consumers, right? These are smart companies, and the way in which these scores are often tilted is towards governance, right? And how do you diversify your board? Are there a lot of women on the board? And I am all about the sisterhood, all right? I fought tooth and nail my whole career, but having a diverse board or offering childcare to your factory workers doesn't negate the fact that the product themselves is not harm free, right? So that's one thing. And again, best in class just is just irrelevant when it comes to there's there's no great tobacco company. So that's a great question, Gabe, and it's a problematic. It's also not everybody understands what each rating agency is trying to solve for. They're different. And as an example, the tobacco companies might disclose on their carbon intensity or disclose on their DENI, and that doesn't mean because they're disclosing, which is great. We need more companies to disclose. That doesn't mean it's a good neighbor company, right? And I think oftentimes that gets a little clouded when you see things like a cigarette or a tobacco company being in sort of the top anything, right? Where there's sort of a gold star attached.
Hmm.
But it's a great question.
Wow. And um, can I relate that to a personal thing that you brought up at the very beginning? You said that before working for tobacco-free portfolios, you were at a value manager. And what was that conversation like? Because, yeah, can you walk me through what that was like when you were making that decision?
No, it's a great conversation. So look, portfolio managers, asset managers don't want to necessarily limit their universe of options, right? For a value tilted manager, tobacco could fall into an investment universe, right? Um, why was that conversation not as difficult as you could imagine it might have been? Because the industry has secular headwinds on top of short-term sort of noise headwinds. So why spend your time? Analysts are already strapped for time when it comes to the investment universe that they can sort of pick stocks from. So why waste your time in analyzing a company that has these sort of headwinds that are, as I mentioned in the presentation, not only there but potentially increasing, right? So that was really it. Surprisingly, not a difficult conversation, and it is one of the more excluded industries. I've seen different numbers, but second most excluded industry behind controversial weapons like cluster bombs.
Mm.
So if you're thinking about that in terms of why, where are we putting our money or where are we excluding? Because we fully understand that exclusion is sort of not the method of first resort. Oftentimes it's the method of last resort. And it's truly about you applying the correct tools for the correct issue. Engagement is effective, as an example, it could be argued in the supply chain where you could engage a distributor or a retailer to not sell tobacco. You're not going to engage tobacco to not create tobacco, right? So there's a difference, and it is nuanced, and it's not just to check the box and move on. It really is a complicated sort of thought process, and it does end up being very reasonable when it comes to tobacco that exclusion makes the most sense.
Hmm. Thank you. And I know we only have a few seconds left, so if you want to finish up by just sharing where people can sign the pledge again,
Yeah,
yeah, go for it.
I'd love. So again, it's tobaccofreeportfolios.org. And we are a global organization. And you can reach out, and if you have any questions, please reach out to Gabe, and would love to communicate and answer any questions that might have come up after seeing this presentation. So thanks so much, Gabe. Thank you for what you all do. I think it's really important for people to be able to sort of peel back the onion and understand where their money is investing and how it impacts people and planet.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Really appreciate having you on.